Hi booktube, Aaron here, hope you're doing very well. Today I've got a bit of a reading update for you. I think since the last random reading update I've finished 4 books, so I'm going to go through and talk a bit about each of them. I'll show you very quickly what they were. So the first one is The Metamorphoses by Ovid. I also read Border, A Journey to the Edge of Europe by Kapka, Kassabova. I read the selected poems of Zbigniew Herbert, and I read A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. Yeah, an interesting assortment. So we'll go through, start with Ovid and take it from there. So Ovid's Metamorphoses, a book that seems to turn up everywhere. Everyone's seems to be influenced by it, retelling stories from it. So a lot of it inspired so much of Shakespeare, his long poem Venus and Adonis, but different tropes and even allusions to it are sort of constantly turning up in his plays. It's in plenty of paintings. It's in the Wasteland. You could think of Pygmalion by Bernard Shaw, and all these things that sort of take their roots from tales from Ovid. I was then just alluding to Ted Hughes' Tales from Ovid, a more recent one. And it's if you have no idea what the Metamorphoses are, it's an assorted tale, or an assortment of tales from classical mythology. Ovid was writing around about the period of the Emperor Augustus, so the first Roman emperor, and it essentially goes from the deep dark past of classical antiquity back to the beginning of the world and the early gods, through all these stories, many of them mischievous and odd, some of them troubling and disturbing, through the Age of Heroes, through to the Trojan War. And then there's a shift at the Trojan War where there's less of a Hellenistic focus, and we're following Aeneas, and then we have the founding of Rome, and sort of stories pertaining more to to Rome and the Republic, and to Julius Caesar, and sort of on from there. A lot of my favourite stories were sort of towards the beginning and sort of towards the middle. There's a really memorable section, and I'm trying to remember it, where it's sort of in that early period of sort of creation, or of the world sort of being in its infancy. And it's so there's a flood, but then we also have the story of Phaethon. I'm not entirely sure how to say his name, who finds out that his father was the sun god, and he wants to meet him, and is his father then, when he meets him, sort of says, okay, whatever you want, I'll grant your wish. And he wants to ride his father's chariot, which is basically the sun. It's how the sun gets from the east to the west. And then his father's like, well, I really wish that you had asked for anything but that. You need an enormous amount of power to control that, and I'm not sure if you're ready for it. And there's a kind of mirroring between that and a later story of Daedalus and Icarus with their wings, and Icarus flying too far to the sun. It's a very similar kind of story, and it is too powerful, and it ends tragically. And one of the effects of this are these massive fires, which of course sort of resonate sort of disturbingly with our present, and both that the destruction of that flood a little earlier on, and the description of these fires is so evocative, and they were some of my favourite parts of the whole thing. Um, but essentially, it's a great place to go to, I think, if you have sort of heard, through cultural osmosis, some of these stories, um, but sort of want to get a bit of a better idea of them, what happened. Um, Essentially, this is like the handbook to classical mythology. You've got most of the big stories, even. Um, there's a mini Iliad in here, there's a mini Odyssey in here, there's a mini um, um, Aeneid in here. All three of those epics, although not everything that happens in them, but parts of those stories are contained in here, and um, are sort of parts of the sort of narrative flow of this whole thing. Um, some of my favourite bits, if we go back, I'm just going to keep going back to the table of contents as a kind of prompt for myself. I won't go into too much detail. Let's have a look. So, yeah, maybe a lot of my favourites are towards the middle, looking at this. So there's the story of Perseus, which I thought I was going to enjoy, and it was okay, but particularly the second part is really oddly violent, and he doesn't come off terribly well. There are these stories that sort of lock together and sort of mirror each other. You quite often get that, and each book tends to have a common thread throughout all the stories about maybe intruding upon something that's forbidden, or it's about lust, or it's about maybe they're all stories about abuse, or about unnatural desire, or something like that will be going through it, and it'll be explored from different directions. So some of it's interesting, some of it's a little disturbing, sometimes it's very funny, and he's a real master of tone and of being able to jump between these different kinds of stories, and he can find a style that sort of suits it. So really, one of my favourite sections is the section pertaining to Orpheus. We get a bit of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and then we get some songs sung by Orpheus, so some other stories, and you sort of forget that that it's sort of Orpheus telling you these stories instead of Ovid, and there's that often happens. There are a few sections where there's a kind of framing device like that, so you can see the influence it would have had on Boccaccio and on Chaucer, and things like that. And it's just lovely towards the end with the I think it's with the death of Orpheus. Let's have a look around page 400 and something. I should have got a bookmark before I started. So he tells all these stories, and then we're eventually told of the death of Orpheus. He's torn apart, and the Maeonids who kill him are punished. But there's just this lovely touch at the end that I thought was lovely. Orpheus's shade passed under the earth. He recognised all the places he'd seen before. As he searched the Elysian fields, he found the wife he had lost and held her close in his arms. At last the lovers could stroll together, side by side, or she went ahead and he followed. Then Orpheus ventured in front, and knew he could now look back on his own Eurydice safely. So yeah, I thought that was lovely. The later stories, the sort of mini Aeneid that goes on, and the stories of the Trojan War, sort of lost me a little bit. I didn't enjoy them quite as much, and certainly as it sort of got closer to Ovid's own historical present, and it was a little less shrouded in a kind of classical past, it seemed a little like it had lost its magic, at least a bit. Um, and so yeah, so a lot of those earlier stories, and there's that bit towards the middle where it's the story of Orpheus, and then these stories that Orpheus is telling or singing. That's the sort of the highlight, the sort of peak of this amazing collection of stories. So yeah, really lovely. I'm sure we'll be coming back to it again. This is the translation by David Rayburn, and it was perfectly serviceable. It's the kind of verse translation where you sort of forget that it's poetry, um, which it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's sort of I don't know. It almost may as well have been prose. I suppose that there was. It didn't necessarily feel like reading poetry, but it was very clear, and you could feel these shifts in tone. So I think he was doing a decent job of at least giving us an impression of what the Latin original is like. But I don't know Latin, so it's just a guess, really. Next up, we have Border by Kapka Kassabova, A Journey to the Edge of Europe. Kapka Kassabova is originally from Bulgaria, and I think grew up in New Zealand and is now living in Scotland, at least at the time of writing this book. And this is a book about the borders between Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece. A very fraught border, and it's about her visiting communities on that border, talking to people, meeting people, going on these little expeditions, and exploring the past of this region, and what it means for the people who have had to live there. And there's really a lot of similarity between a lot of these communities on either side, particularly in Thrace, which is a region that spreads over really the three countries. So we've got a nice map here. So we've got Eastern Thrace here on the European side of Turkey. It's got Istanbul there, and then Anatolia that way. Bulgaria up here, but just up here you see we have Northern Thrace, and then we have Western Thrace there. There's this whole sort of region sort of around here, and there's generally a common shared identity of being Thracian in this area, that people are proud of it, whether they're Bulgarian or whether they're Turkish or whatever. And there are these other little similarities that turn up. It felt as if there's this interesting relationship that she has with Bulgaria. She was born there, spent the early part of her life there, and then as things seem to be falling apart, I think towards the end of it was either just before the Soviet Union broke up, or it might have been after it had broken up, and yeah, things got a bit bad, really, in so many countries that were either part of the Soviet Union or had relied on it, like Bulgaria. And essentially, yeah, she has this great a sort of situation is really intriguing, because she's kind of an insider in a way. She knows the culture, speaks the language, comes from that place, but she's been away enough, I think, to be able to see it as an outsider might, because as well the country has changed so much, and she's also travelling to places in Bulgaria that wasn't where she lived, and so again there's that a little bit of distance there, and there's certainly a sort of homeliness and attraction to this village that she sort of settles in and uses as her base early in the book, and she comes back to it at the end, and she really sort of describes and sort of gives us an impression of that area really, really evocatively, and is really lovely. And then she's sort of traveling around, and she's going down to Turkey, and again there are these similarities, and for all the cultural differences and all the things that I don't know might seem a little off-putting, I suppose. Um, there's still a commonality, and she still feels this really strong emotional attachment. And then as she's going over to Greece, I'd say some of the escapades she gets up to in Greece are some of the points where she seems the most vulnerable, and she seems the less sure of herself, which I found intriguing. Um, and Yeah, I'm still, I don't know, I feel like the relationship between um, Turkey and Bulgaria was covered sort of much more, and I got a better understanding of what was going on there. And as soon as Greece was brought into question, we got, still plenty of information, but it felt like, I don't know, like it was slightly less in focus or something. Which is it's not necessarily a criticism. It's just sort of looking back at it, my general impression. But I wanted to read you a little bit from this. It's a chapter where they're in this town. They may even be in, Edirne, or Edirne, which I think was formerly Adrianople, and she's met this couple at a cafe, and everyone at the cafe thinks that they must be famous because the um, one of them, the woman, looks like she could be a movie star, and we know, and the man has told us what his job is. He's a chauffeur for very rich people, and so he can afford, the clothes he's wearing, and to order everything on the menu, stuff like that. She never says what her job is, and they're going in, and they're going through their history, how they were both from Turkish families, sort of Turkish communities in Bulgaria, and essentially, literally, I think it was literally months before the Berlin Wall came down, unless I'm muddling up stories. The authorities, I think in Bulgaria and in Turkey, decided to do this swap, the kind you often hear about in a lot of 20th century politics, and it's always disastrous and terrible. And essentially, if you're from a Turkish community in Bulgaria, well, you're Turkish, so you should go to Turkey, even if, like these people that she's talking to, this family have lived in Bulgaria for generations and generations and generations. They don't speak Turkish; they speak Bulgarian. There are all these differences that they have to most Bulgarians, and yet they're, sort of nominally, if you were to tick a box, they're Turkish, so they should go to Turkey. And it was heartbreaking and an arduous process. And when they got to Turkey, there was these refugee camps for them, and it was squalid and sad. And the guy who became a chauffeur had to go through a lot to sort of rebuild his life. And he met this woman who's now his wife, and her situation was that her mother didn't want her and her siblings to be staying in the refugee camp, and so instead, she put them in an orphanage, and she went off and worked, and would just sort of check in on them every now and then. And this, as a young girl, this woman, I think the first time she went up to a Turkish person, she tried to say something to them in Bulgarian, and was sort of chastised for it, told off. You should only speak to me in Turkish. Since then, she's never said anything in Bulgarian. She's only spoken Turkish. And the chapter it's from is called "The Girl Between Languages," and essentially towards the end, then we sort of find out who she is, what she's done, what her life is, what her job is, And with that background, it just takes on a wonderful but sort of tragic significance. So this is the last couple of paragraphs of that chapter. Over dinner, Ahmed had kept mentioning Aisha's kids. So Aisha is the woman, Ahmed is the chauffeur, and I thought he meant their own. But what he meant was the kids at the special school where she worked. She had never stopped working, not even when Ahmed was sleeping on French benches. Aisha was a teacher for deaf children. In the holidays, she took them on bus trips around Turkey and across the border into Bulgaria, which involved heavy paperwork, but she didn't mind because the kids loved it. While Ahmed explained this, Aisha's face lit up and she said something in sign language, but neither Ahmed nor I understood it. I saw her standing in that school bus, saying something to the kids that no one else understands, not even the driver, and the kids laughing. I saw her with her kindred spirits in the homeland of silence, where no one can tell what you are. And yeah, so that floored me, and that there are so many other sort of similar moments and just these really human, empathetic moments. And it's just a wonderful book that, although there are these sort of terrible stories behind everything, there is a sense of hope and of decency in there, sort of keeping you from despair. So I'll leave it there. There's a lot more to the book than that, but it was really good. So if you're into sort of travel writing and sort of 20th century politics and sort of that part of the world, then give it a go. Very quickly then, I won't ramble on too much about the other two books, but we've got selected poems by Zbigniew Herbert, a Polish poet who I think lived through the Second World War and then through communist Poland, I believe. I've read this before, and it's a case where I'm just sort of re-evaluating the poet a second time through. It was about 3 or 4 years ago, the last time I read this. He's quite I suppose he is quite an avant-garde poet in a way. For Debs from Raina Reed's stuff, I know she was recently saying how she doesn't like people who don't use punctuation, and I'm afraid Zbigniew Herbert never or rarely uses punctuation in his poetry, but there's it gives a kind of harshness to the poetry. It seems very, I don't know how to think of it. I don't know, it's like something printed into rock almost. But there's often an irony to the poetry. He takes a lot of influence from religious imagery and from mythology as well. But often, in the background is the context that he's living in. Like there was one about a royal family, called The End of a Dynasty, where it's like a whole royal family in one room. You're sort of guessing it sort of reminds me of the Romanovs. I'm not entirely sure if that's what he's getting at. But then at the end, he says, as for the valet, he stood against a partition and tried to imitate the tapestry, which is a funny image, but also a really scary image, right? That's what he's doing to try and blend in. And he never actually mentions in the rest of the poem, I don't think that these people are in danger, that they're going to be killed, and yet just that sentence there, that mention of what the valet or the valet's doing, implies that there's danger coming, that they're in a dangerous situation. Not much more really to say about him, but he's a poet I find really, really interesting, and I probably will be coming back to him. The book is falling apart though, or at least if I show you the cover, as you can see, it's bits are sort of crumbling off. It's I need to sort of sellotape it, but also the back cover is coming off, so it could do some work. When I bought it, the spine had completely bleached, so I've just sort of scrawled the title on there so I know what it is. So it really is falling apart, but really, really intriguing, quirky, but oftentimes dark poems. And then finally, we've got A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. My plan originally was to read this for Historathon. I suppose I still have done, but with Historathon, the idea is that you read non-fiction history throughout the year, and in each quarter of the year you're looking at specific periods. So I was going to split this up and read it in conjunction with another book, but it's quite a short book, as you can see, and I got the impression that the sort of rhythm of the book, the idea of the book, was that it's this sort of long sweeping history, each chapter sort of running into the next, and it felt quite difficult just to leave it. So I was reading it after a while in these longer stretches, and I just decided to read the whole book. It begins with the beginning of the universe, with at least the scientific theories of his day, of the formation of the earth, the beginning of life, all through to early humans, and then the beginnings of civilization and ancient civilizations, and all these different people groups, and through to the Romans, through to the Middle Ages, right up to his present, and what he thinks needs to be done, and it's a really intriguing book. I feel like Wells really was an optimistic. I think he was a sort of utopian socialist, and there's actually a really fascinating chapter in here, if I can find it, which is, I think it's this one, towards the end, about 200 pages in, a chapter called The Development of Modern Political and Social Ideals, which is about sort of, I suppose, living standards, and about the rise of socialism. And for him, socialism is essentially a movement addressing the issue of proprietorship, or people and their property, having maybe too much property, who owns what, and and then you have Marx, and he's not particularly Wells isn't particularly a fan of Marx, but he does say there's an interesting symmetry between Marx and, is it Adam Smith, even though that they're not, that they're coming from very different places, and yet they're both trying, I think, to work out through basically economics, how to better people's lives, and maybe bring so better living standards, and what's the word I'm thinking of? So I suppose prosperity for as many people as possible. So I found that really intriguing. He doesn't really give any answers there. Doesn't go too much into his own understanding, but he's definitely an optimist. He's beginning with sort of more early natural history, I suppose, and then as soon as it's human history, he's sort of very quick to see, okay, here's this civilization springing up here, and this is why they're important. This is this civilization, and very quickly it sort of becomes building blocks, so that each civilization is building on the achievements of the last, and innovating, and there are these sort of odd moments of maybe things going backwards, or things being put on pause, like the fall of the Roman Empire, and that's sort of how he sees things. And I don't think I quite see things exactly the same way, and I'm certainly not as optimistic as he is. And despite his optimism, he does address the First World War. This was written, well, the edition I have is from the 30s, and so he's addressing the First World War and the sort of mess that Europe was in following the First World War, and he just sort of address maybe what needs to be done. Let's see. Yeah, let's say. Yeah, I'll read this bit. So it becomes more and more clearly manifest that a huge work of reconstruction has to be done by mankind if a crescendo of such convulsions and world massacres as that of the Great War is to be averted. No such hasty improvisation as the League of Nations, no patched-up system of conferences between this group of states and that, which change nothing with an air of settling everything, will meet the complex political needs of the new age that lies before us. A systematic development and systematic application of the sciences of human relationship, of personal and group psychology, of financial and economic science, and of education, sciences still only in their infancy, is required. Narrow and obsolete, dead and dying moral and political ideas have to be replaced by a clearer and a simpler conception of the common origins and destinies of our kind. And that was actually something I found quite good actually early on about early civilizations and things is, because he's talking about all these ethnic people groups, and this kind of language in the hands of anyone else could start to feel very, very uncomfortable. And whereas some people may draw more and more distinctions, what he's sort of trying to do with this book is, sort of show that this is a common a common history, and we're all in this together, and yeah, we have common energies and we share a common destiny. So I kind of like that, but I'm not quite as optimistic. He does think that eventually it seems almost inevitable that we'll have to work together, and there'll be a kind of world order and sort of a one single state, and all of our problems will eventually all be worked out. And I very much doubt that's the case. It seems like we're really just running in circles, and we're still living with many of the problems that he was describing there. And so we'll see if something can be done. And so although I don't quite share his optimism, and although sometimes it felt just the form of the book, the fact that it's such a short history going over such a broad period of time, of course things are going to get brushed over, and so again that was something I didn't particularly love, and sort of wished that it wasn't just a short history. I sort of wish that he went into more detail sometimes, but there we go. So I'll leave it there. I hope I haven't rambled on for too long, but yeah, hope you found at least something interesting in there. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.